Today's lecture is called The Deconstruction of Physicalism. Yesterday I talked about dualism, and I said that dualism was an answer to one of two questions: how many substances are there, or how many independent kinds of properties are there? The principal argument for dualism, I said, was the conceivability argument, and because the important idea in dualism is the independence of the two things. And you establish that the two things are independent by conceiving them to be distinct. And then you establish that it's possible that they are separable, and then that makes them separate things. That's the basic argument of Descartes' sixth meditation, and it's the argument that you find in Chalmers's, generalizing over all the details, the argument that you find in David Chalmers's book, The Conscious Mind. I said that we shouldn't ask these questions about substances and properties. I said we're not obliged to ask them, and I demonstrated why I thought that the conceivability argument fails. Today I'm going to talk about physicalism or materialism. I'm using those words in pretty much the same way, but I have one more thing to say about that. I want to distinguish two questions. This is going to be my main point. What's the relationship between the mental and the physical? That's one question. The other question is, what is the relationship between the mind and the body? And people often treat these as if they're the same question. I want to say they're different questions. This is, I suppose, my main take-home message for today. And physicalism, I say, is the answer to number one. Question number one. And there are other kinds of answers to question number one too, and including panpsychism. And I'll have something to say about panpsychism because I think it's worth illustrating. It illustrates the general point that I want to make. There's going to be no suspense about what my conclusion is. My conclusion is that we should pursue question number two and not question number one. We should try and dismantle question number one, deconstruct it. So these are the points I'll say. First something about physicalism, then something about the idea of the qualitative. That relates to what we were talking about yesterday about qualia. Then I'll say a little bit about the brain, and then I will conclude. So first, physicalism. Yesterday we were talking about substance, and I'm talked about mental substances, that each of us is a mental substance, but according on Descartes' view, there is only one material substance, because that's the only thing that's as independent existence is the entire material universe. And this is its characteristic attribute. Every substance is distinguished by its characteristic attribute. The characteristic attribute of material substance is what he called extension, that is to say, size and shape. This is not the conception of matter that we have today in modern physics. And it's not a conception of matter that philosophers employ today either. Those philosophers who do work on matter tend to adopt the conception of matter that we have in modern physics. And I think perhaps as a historical hypothesis, perhaps this partly explains the move from talking about materialism to talking about physicalism. There's a similar kind of ethos or ideology behind both terms, but physics recognizes many things that are not matter, forces, fields, and space-time, for example. So instead of saying that everything is material, we say everything is physical, where that is the subject matter of physics. Something like that. David Lewis defends what he calls physicalist metaphysics, which is metaphysics built to endorse the truth and descriptive completeness of physics, more or less as we know it. And physicalist metaphysics involves claims about the nature of the physical world. And here's the way to get to the definition of physicalism as normally used, perhaps the standard definition, which is you start with the idea of a physical property, And Lewis defines this as perfectly natural intrinsic properties which need nothing bigger than a point at which to be instantiated. That's just an example. You don't need Lewis's conception. It's just that he just pointing out that he has a specific conception of physical properties. But the main point is that everything supervenes on this arrangement of properties. That's from Lewis's paper, New Work for a Theory of Universals from 1983. Now, in more recent work, and as many of you will know, people have tried to define physicalism using other notions, and one particularly popular concept at the moment is the concept of grounding, an idea created by Kit Fine and Gideon Rosen, and many people have tried to defend physicalism in terms of the idea that everything is grounded in the physical. Nothing I say will depend on talking about supervenience or grounding. I would have liked to have talked about grounding as well, but that would have taken another lecture. In case anyone wonders, I'm a grounding skeptic, so as you might guess. I don't know. So I'm a skeptic about grounding. I'm also a bit of a skeptic about supervenience. The precise way to define the supervenience, this claim that everything supervenes on the arrangement of properties, comes from Lewis, but it's nicely stated by Michael Tye in this quote where he says, "Every possible world which is a minimal microphysical duplicate of the actual world is a duplicate simpliciter." I mean, that in other words, suppose God wanted to create this world exactly as it is. What would God have to do to create the world exactly this world as it is with all its complexity? According to physicalists, all God would have to do to create that world would be to create its physical nature. The God here is an expository device, but however, physicalists would say that all God would have to do to create this world with all its complexity would be to create its physical nature, and everything else would just come for free. So it's interesting actually that if physicalism were true, God wouldn't need 6 days to create the universe. He'd only need 1 day. Because he'd create all the physical matter and everything else would come for free. And he wouldn't need the other 5 days. Sorry?
There isn't anything else.
Well, there are all the things that are dependent on the physical, you see, that come just as a matter of the organisation of the physical. So that's the idea of supervenience physicalism, that you fix the physical and then you fix everything. So rather, as if you're going to paint a painting on a wall, all you need to do is put the paint on the wall, and then you get the picture. You don't have to paint the picture on top, moving the paint around. So that's the thought. So maybe if physicalism were true, then we could actually have a 1-day working week with 6 days of holiday, and then instead of 6 days with 1 day of holiday, so the day of rest, God could have rested for 6 days. Anyway, this is that notion of supervenience. That is, if it's not familiar, the basic idea is just that the physical nature of the world determines everything. By the physical nature, David Lewis claims that this is the arrangement of microphysical particles determines everything else. And this, of course, implies that there is some relationship between the quantum mechanical reality, those are the smallest particles that we know in particle physics, and everything else. And anyone who knows anything about quantum physics or the philosophy of quantum physics knows that this is an incredibly obscure and complicated issue. And in fact, it is one of the main philosophical, it's why there is a philosophy of quantum physics, because no one knows really how to connect the effective science of quantum mechanics with the macroscopic reality. This is a huge question in physics and also in the philosophy of physics. So it's this is one of the reasons I say that physicalism is a view that no one really understands, because it's not, in order to evaluate this view, if we can't begin to answer that question, how can we begin to assess whether everything supervenes on the physical or not? If we don't even understand what the kind of relationship could be. It's one thing to say it supervenes, but the famous puzzle of Schrödinger's cat shows that we don't really know how these things are connected. when I say we, I mean physicists don't know how the macroscopic world is connected to the underlying quantum reality. Before assessing whether supervenient physicalism is true, we need to know what it means. And I throw this out. I'm not going to talk about this anymore, but I'll just offer this as my view that it's really not very clear. And we shouldn't begin by endorsing a view when we're not entirely clear what exactly it means. So I'm not going to talk about the usual standard objections to physicalism. I talked about the conceivability argument yesterday. There are other arguments too. I'm just offering that as a point of skepticism about whether we fully understand the view. However, people who are interested in this mental physical question, in this big metaphysical issue, say, well, you don't actually have to formulate it in this way. You don't actually have to formulate it by making assumptions about quantum mechanics, because we can formulate the question in another way. And in another way, that shows how we can have a mental physical problem without having to think in terms of the problems of quantum mechanics. And this is another way of thinking about the relationship between consciousness and the physical world. This approach is inspired by Bertrand Russell in his book, The Analysis of Matter, from 1927. And it relies on a distinction between the quantitative and the qualitative, things that are quantitatively described and things that are qualitatively described. And this is what I'm going to look at next. So I've said something about physicalism, the usual supervenience understanding of physicalism, and that raises a question, which is how to tie the microphysical to the macroscopic world, how to understand that connection. And I say this is a bit of a problem for physicalists who want to adopt that kind of view. The alternative is to think an alternative is to think that we don't actually have to assume anything about quantum mechanics and the rest of the world. We just assume something very general about physics, and then we see that there's a problem there for understanding consciousness. And this is what I'm going to describe next. Problem, the qualitative. Now, the starting point for this idea, inspired by Russell, is that the physical world is wholly describable in mathematical or quantitative terms, sometimes called structural terms. The physical world is described in structural terms, just described in terms of how matter is disposed to behave. Say, for example, in Newton's laws, you have something. You have the Newton's law that force equals mass times acceleration. That is a purely structural law, which just describes simply how bodies are disposed to accelerate under forces. Then people say that conscious experience is not wholly describable in mathematical or structural terms. But conscious experience, or the qualities of conscious experience, nonetheless exist somewhere. So this is how people who think in this way start posing this problem. Here's what Russell himself says. This is where he starts. Physics in itself is exceedingly abstract and reveals only certain mathematical characteristics of the material with which it deals. It does not tell us anything as to the intrinsic character of this material. So if you say force equals mass times acceleration, all you're doing, and you can measure that, you can then attach numbers to forces and to masses and to accelerations, and there's a simple mathematical formula then which relates those three quantities. All you're doing, according to Russell, is not talking about the intrinsic nature of things, but rather talking about the abstract mathematical, or what these days people call the structural nature. So I did just a comment on this. Sometimes people say, rather than structural, they say functional. That it's just about the functional nature of these physical quantities, how they're related functionally. This is all very confusing, because it used to be the case that people would contrast function and structure. So when people talked about, for example, the difference between anatomy and physiology, that physiology is about anatomy is about the structure and physiology is about the function of things. So it's all very confusing. Unfortunately, we have to live with that confusion. Structure and function mean the same thing in this debate, and it's contrasted here with intrinsic. Russell's talking about the intrinsic character of the material. So here's a recent example of someone, Philip Goff, who talks about this in terms of what he calls Galileo's error. He wrote a book called Galileo's Error. Galileo. Let me read the quote and then I'll explain what it means. The success of mathematical physics, Goff says, resulted in limiting the scope of inquiry. By putting the sensory qualities we encounter in conscious experience, the colours, smells, tastes and sounds, outside the domain of the physical sciences, we're able to give a purely mathematical description of what's left over. But those qualities that Galileo took out of the material world still exist somewhere. And must still be accounted for somehow. If the spicy taste of the paprika isn't really in the paprika, well then where is it? Galileo thought it was in the soul, but we don't want to believe in souls, then we need to find a place in the natural world for the sensory qualities. So here the key ideas are that the sensory qualities we encounter in conscious experience were taken out of the world by Galileo. Galileo famously said, God has written the book of the world in squares and circles. And to understand the great book of the world, we have to understand the language that it's written in. And the world is describable mathematically, not in terms of qualities. Now, Goff says the sensory qualities still exist. So where are they? If they're not in our soul, where are these sensory qualities? So this is how he poses the problem, and the contrast between the mathematical description of the physical world and the sensory qualities. Now this leads Goff and other thinkers towards the remarkable view of panpsychism, which says that the only way to solve this problem is to say that consciousness is inherent in all matter. That ultimate matter, the intrinsic qualities of matter, are actually conscious qualities. And this is my summary of the argument from panpsychism, which is a summary of arguments from Goff and Hedda Hassel-Murch and others. First, we start with the assumption that I've just been talking about, that physicalism holds that the world is describable in purely physical terms. Physical descriptions are necessarily only mathematical or structural or quantitative. The physical description of matter is incomplete, so says the panpsychist, or actually so says anyone who poses the problem in these terms. Physicalism leaves out the qualitative or intrinsic dimension of matter. And we know that consciousness is qualitative and not quantitative. The conjecture then is that consciousness is the qualitative or intrinsic basis of all matter, or in other words, that all matter is conscious. And that's panpsychism. Now, there are many things to say about this kind of argument. Just one thing, this isn't supposed to be a deductively valid argument. This is meant to be, I think, an inference to the best explanation. The last conjecture is supposed to be conjecture. If consciousness is the intrinsic basis of all matter, something we know to be qualitative, then that would explain what the intrinsic nature of matter is. I'm going to focus just on these two moves in the argument that physicalism leaves out the qualitative or intrinsic dimension of matter, and that we know that consciousness is qualitative and not quantitative, because I'm going to draw some general lessons based on that. Now, I think the central notion here is the notion of the qualitative. What is that? Well, start with the quantitative. We know what that is, because the quantitative is what's described mathematically, or perhaps wholly describable in mathematical terms. It's measurable, mathematically measurable. And this was Russell's starting point. So what do we say about qualitative? Well, one obvious thing we could say is that the qualitative is the non-quantitative. And this is, I think, a perfectly good contrast. It's what I call the market research conception of the qualitative. As anyone who knows anything about market research will know that there's quantitative market research, which uses numbers and statistics and things like this. And then there's qualitative market research, which involves focus groups and asking people questions, and that's qualitative. And it's called quant and qual. So if you work in market research, you're either a quant person or you're a qual person. It's a bit like philosophy, actually. Philosophy has the quant people and the qual people. And you could also actually combine them. You could have the quali-quant people, the people who are quant but they're sort of more qual, or people who are more quant, or the quanti-quant, the really quant people, like Timothy Williamson. If you're watching, Tim, this is you. You're the real quant person. Or you could have the ultimate qual philosophers, and you can choose your own idea. Anyway, but in market research, this is a real distinction, and there are two different kinds of market researchers. And there, qualitative just means non-quantitative. I mean, stuff that's written in words rather than in numbers, but it's non-quantitative. That's the thing. So that's one idea of qualitative, just non-quantitative. But how does that get us anywhere in connection with panpsychism? Now, Russell says that physics only describes intrinsic structure, only describes structure, not the intrinsic nature. So that idea has to come in somewhere. And this is a quantitative description. So the quantitative descriptions only describe the structure, not intrinsic nature. So the intrinsic nature, the argument would go, must be non-quantitative then. Because if it were quantitative, then it could be described by physics. So therefore, it must be qualitative, they say. And consciousness is qualitative too. That's something else that's qualitative. So this is how we get the rabbit out of the hat of panpsychism, by associating the idea of qualitative as the non-quantitative with the qualitative as the conscious. Now, I think these are two senses of the word qualitative, right? We have this idea that there's the purely market research sense of qualitative, which just means non-quantitative, which doesn't really apply anything of substance. And then there's our old friend qualia, the qualia we talked about yesterday. Because qualia are supposed to be the intrinsic qualities of experience. There's a famous paper by Gilbert Harman attacking the idea of qualia, which is called The Intrinsic Qualities of Experience. He's against it. What's the connection between these two? There must be some connection. There has to be a connection. They have to make a connection here. Otherwise, we don't get the link from intrinsic to non-quantitative to qualitative, and therefore to consciousness. And so it's that concept of the qualitative there in the middle which is holding the whole thing together. And this is actually how they argue. So here's Hedda Murch. She says, the hard problem of matter. The hard problem of matter is this is the way that panpsychists like to talk now. They now say that what they're doing is actually solving the problem of matter, not the problem of consciousness. The hard problem of matter calls for non-structural properties, that is, intrinsic properties, and consciousness is the one phenomenon we know that might meet this need. So again, it's an inference to the best explanation. Consciousness is full of qualitative properties, from the redness of red to the discomfort of hunger to the phenomenology of thought. Such experiences, or qualia, may have internal structure, but there's more to them than structure. We know something about what conscious experiences are like in and of themselves, not just how they function and relate to other properties. And that, I think, that shows how the panpsychist moves from structural not being enough, or quantitative and structural not being enough, to there must be something else, that must be the intrinsic must be non-quantitative, therefore qualitative, and we know that mental things are qualitative. Unfortunately, if you came to this without having any idea what anyone meant by qualitative, this wouldn't really help you. So, it's a bit of a I say it's a sort of conjuring trick, the whole thing. There's a sort of sleight of hand in the whole thing, which moves from this notion of the qualitative as meaning the non-quantitative, in order to be the intrinsic basis of matter, and then bringing in the notion of the qualitative that we learn from discussions of qualia and the secondary qualities, the redness of red, the sound of a trumpet, and so on. These are then hypothesized to be the intrinsic qualities of matter. So, I've mentioned very briefly two ways to pose the mind-body question, which I think are dubious. One is in terms of necessary supervenience, and I mentioned some reason to be skeptical about that way of formulating the problem. And the other is in terms of the quantitative-qualitative solution, distinction. Notice that the quantitative-qualitative solution, the only thing it presupposes about physics is that physics is quantitative, is purely quantitative, that's all. So it doesn't make any presuppositions about the nature of microphysical properties. What's behind all this? Why are people posing the question in this way? We started talking about the mind and consciousness, and we ended up with these very abstract models of reality, the supervenience model and the panpsychist model. What's behind it all? I want to say that what's behind it is and this is a conjecture, I don't say it follows, but it's the idea of substance. It's the same idea. It's the starting point. Physicalism, dualism, and panpsychism, they want to answer the questions which lie behind the doctrine of substance, namely, what is the fundamental nature of the world? Does the world have one fundamental nature? Or does it have two? And if it has two, how do they fit together? And that's why I say this question is a question about they don't necessarily say that they believe in substance, but they are answering the same urge, they are responding to the same urge as those who believe in substance, which is to say something in general about the most fundamental nature of the world. But I say if we reject substance, then we're not obliged to ask these questions. If we say we don't begin our metaphysics with substance, we can begin with other categories. We could begin with that. We can have the category of object, the category of property, the category of event, process, relation. We can have all these metaphysical categories. But if we don't have this idea of substance, which is the idea of the most fundamental being, then we don't have to ask these questions. Does the world have a fundamental nature? So, where does that leave the mind-body problem then? Does this mean if we don't ask the question of substance, does this mean there's no mind-body problem? Chomsky, in a number of places over the years, Chomsky has said that the whole, and I'm inspired by Chomsky in this respect, that the whole mind-body problem rests on this 17th century idea of substance. And once you abandon that idea, then there isn't a mind-body problem at all. Is that right? Well, I don't think it is. So this is why this is the mental physical problem I'm talking about here, and I don't think that that's the whole story, because so the mind-body problem doesn't vanish. Because I want to say, aren't we forgetting something at this point? There's something that we know which we've forgotten when we ask about the mind-body problem, when we formulate the mind-body problem in terms of the relationship between the physical world and the mental, and that is the brain. So I'm going to bring the brain back into the picture here. So this is the really hard science part of my talk, where I'm going to show pictures of brains. There is another question. The question I'm interested in is the question about the brain, which is how are mental capacities embodied in the brain and the body? So when I talk about the brain here, I'm going to talk about the brain and the body together. It's not realistic to think of the brain separately from the body, but when I talk about the brain, that's shorthand for the brain and the body. How are mental capacities? So by capacities, I mean things like the capacity for thought. We have the capacity for thought, we have the capacity for visual perception, we have the capacity for reasoning, the capacity for language, the capacity to understand language or to produce language. We have the capacity for memory. These are the capacities I'm talking about. And these are capacities of organisms. That's my starting point. Human beings and other animals that have mental capacities. I'll say a little bit more about capacities later, but that's the starting point. So then the question is, how are these capacities embodied? Now, a lot is known about the human brain. I'm not going to use what I call the scientific we, when philosophers sometimes say, we know a lot about the first 5 minutes of the universe, or we know a lot about the way the brain is built. I can't claim that knowledge. I'd say people know a lot about it. There's people who've done all this research. There's a lot of knowledge about that, but it's the scientific we, a bit like the royal we. We said the brain contains around 100 billion neurons. And a lot is known about the anatomy of the brain and the structure of the brain, and the physiology, its function. Here's structure and function used where they're distinguished, unlike in the talk of the quantitative. And the brain cells, neurons, are very well studied by neuroscientists. And here's a nice, rather beautiful drawing of a neuron. And here's a more complicated diagram of a neuron, which shows the synaptic cleft where the neurotransmitters jump across into the receptors over here, and this is the fundamental connection between neurons. So there are the brain cells, and then there are the parts of the brain, and a lot is known about that too. The different, and here's a very simplistic diagram where different areas of the brain are assigned different psychological functions. Now, a student of mine told me about this book and the film that was based on this book. I don't know whether anyone's seen this film. Have you seen this film? It's written a book by a woman called Julie Powell, American writer, who decided that she was going to cook every recipe, or every 365 recipes, 524 recipes from the book by Julia Child, the American cookery writer. I think this was a famous book on French cookery. And she decided that every day she was going to cook one of the recipes from this book, and she wrote about it. And there was a film was made with Meryl Streep playing Julia Child and Amy Adams playing this, the author, Julie Powell. And one of the recipes she cooks is the classic French dish of deep-fried brains. In the earlier version of this talk that I gave, I actually had a picture there of a plate of raw brains, but I thought maybe that would offend some people to see raw brains, so I won't show you this. But if you know what a brain looks like, what's striking about the brain is that it's very soft and it has a consistency of yogurt. So it's very thick, yogurty consistency. It's mostly fat, of course. In France, they like to bread the brains and then deep fry them. So it's like frying a piece of fat in another piece of fat. It's actually quite delicious, but you mustn't eat more than a couple of them, if you like that kind of thing. I realise that some people wouldn't be interested in eating brains, but people do eat them. And she describes eating brains. She describes cooking this dish with the brains, and it's a rather great quotation. She's rather repelled by it in a way. But it wasn't because she finds it disgusting. It's just one piece of fat, and she's cooking all this French food, and it's all full of parts of animals and fat. But she said the real problem is the philosophical tailspin part, the inconsolable mystery of life, consciousness, the soul. But it's just this flabby, pale, small organ that disintegrates in your fingers if you let the tap run too fast. How can this be? How can we be? She says. And I think there she really expresses something which it's impossible not to feel. If you see a real brain, you don't have to see a real brain, you just can see a picture of a brain, or just, I can tell you what a brain looks like if you don't want to look at a real brain. Or look at a pickled brain in a museum, and you think, that is the basis of consciousness. The soul, the inconsolable mystery of life. How can that thing be the basis of consciousness? That thing, this sort of... Colin McGinn said somewhere in one of these papers, he said, it seems like the wrong kind of materials to create consciousness. I mean, it's not obvious what the right kind of materials would be, but you sort of see his point. It's just so extraordinary that this lump of fat could be the basis of your consciousness. Now, and then when you understand that all the 100 billion cells in there look like this, I mean, they don't look like this, but this is a diagram of, of all the little bits of them. You think, yeah, well, that's fine, but, what's this got to do with consciousness, intentionality, the will, belief, desire, emotion, value, language, the subject's perception of the world, all the things that matter to us? How can that just come out of that material? How does it work? So it's a combination of the enormous amount of knowledge that scientists have about how the brain actually works at the level of cells and of overall structure, and this kind of puzzle about how that could be the basis of all our mental capacities. Or how it is the basis of our mental capacities. We don't even have to say could be, how it is the basis of this. Now the question here, I think, is a question about explanation, and it's a question about understanding. It's about how we understand how these things hang together. It's kind of a matter of making it intelligible to us, how these things hang together. So it's not, I think, a question about ontology. It's not a question of, one substance or two. If I ask, how can this thing be the basis of thought, consciousness, experience, and emotion, and everything? I'm asking for understanding. I'm asking for enlightenment. I'm assuming that it is the basis of thought, emotion, experience, and so on. And I want to say that it's that's a kind of mystery. It's not an ontological question. It's not necessarily an ontological question. Someone could translate it into an ontological question. You say that the only way that this could be is if this isn't the basis of, so it couldn't be actually, or that something else is the basis of consciousness. But I want to say that even if you reject the idea that something else is the basis of consciousness, even if you say that the brain is in some way the basis of consciousness, this doesn't assume physicalism. And this is one of the points I want to make. It doesn't assume physicalism. It doesn't assume that everything, physicalism as defined above, right, that everything supervenes with necessity on the arrangement of microphysical particles. You could be completely indifferent to that question, or you could be agnostic. I said, I have no idea. I could say, which I think is my view, I have no idea whether that's true, because I don't know how the microphysical particles are related to the macroscopic particles, and I don't know how you would ever know that they were related by this relation of necessary supervenience. So I just suspend belief on this. Nonetheless, I know independently that the brain is the organ that is largely responsible for conscious experience, and I find that very puzzling. So you can legitimately ask that question without making the assumption of physicalism. And in fact, you don't have to make any assumptions about the nature of the physical world in general. You don't have to assume that the physical world is entirely quantitative in nature. You could, in principle, have an Aristotelian conception of the physical world as consisting of Aristotelian substances rather than Cartesian substances, and still be baffled by the role of the brain in producing consciousness. I'm not referring to Aristotle's own view about the brain, but supposing you already know that the brain is responsible for consciousness, but you have an Aristotelian metaphysics. That's a possibility. And you could still find it deeply confusing, or baffling, or mysterious. So this is why I want to say that physicalism is irrelevant to the mind-body question. The mind-body question being the question of the relationship between mind and body, not the question of how does the mental or consciousness fit into the world as described by physics. That's the question that physicalism is an answer to, and I want to say that that is actually irrelevant. I go further. I'd say that physicalism is neither necessary nor sufficient for addressing the question about the brain. Suppose we put to one side the question of souls, immaterial souls, or anything beyond the material world, and we're looking at the brain and we think that's the organ of consciousness. How does that work? In order to ask that question, you don't have to assume physicalism. So, I want to say it's not necessary to assume physicalism, because, for example, just even putting it in the metaphysical substance terms, a dualist or panpsychist needs also to address this question. Descartes himself actually addressed the question of how the brain was connected to consciousness. He had a view about this. And a panpsychist has to address it too, because if all matter is conscious, that doesn't explain the difference between the brain and all the rest of the matter. So panpsychist there is in exactly the same position as the physicalist. It's not sufficient in order to address the question about the brain. You haven't addressed the question about the brain by addressing physicalism, because merely saying that everything is physical does not tell you why certain parts of the physical world are capable of producing consciousness. Just to refer back to the paper that I wrote with Hugh Mellor many years ago, we had a joke in the paper, but it didn't really catch on, so I'll say it again, which was that if you say that all flesh is grass, as you know, as it says in the book of Isaiah, all flesh is grass, this doesn't explain the difference between carnivores and vegetarians. If all flesh is grass, then cows are made of grass too. Right? But why is it okay to eat a cow, not to eat grass, but not to eat a cow, or to eat a lettuce, but not to eat a cow? Right? There must be a difference between the grass that cows are made of and the grass that lettuces are made of, or the atoms that they're made of and the atoms that cows are made of. So that's adopting physicalism will not, by itself, answer the the mind-body question. Sorry, I'm labouring this point, but it's something that even physicalists accept. They think that even if they're committed to physicalism, they still have to close the explanatory gap, as they call it. So, but my other point is that it's not necessary even for asking the brain question. In order to, it's not necessary to assume physicalism. You don't have to assume physicalism. You can be neutral. You can be agnostic on the question of physicalism, and still want to answer the brain question. So I want to go as far as to say that it's the question even is irrelevant. The question of physicalism is irrelevant to answering the brain question. And here I could start with a weaker claim, and my weaker claim would be that you don't need to raise the question. This is what I've just said. You don't need to raise the question in order to investigate the mind-body relation. But ideally, I'd like to push for an even stronger claim, which is that without the substance assumption, the whole question of physicalism versus dualism withers away. And this is, I think, this was Chomsky's point, but Chomsky thought that that applied to the mind-body question itself. I don't think it does, because even if the question of physicalism versus dualism withers away, then the brain question remains. So let me lead you now to my conclusions. As I say, my main aim in this lecture has been to distinguish two questions which I think are not sufficiently distinguished in the contemporary philosophical work on mind and body. And this is the question of what's the place of the mind or consciousness in the world as conceived by physics. And the other question is, how is the mind embodied in the brain, or embodied in the brain and body of the organism? And I want to say these are different questions. I think that question one relies really on what I'm calling the substance assumptions, the assumption that there must be a fundamental nature to reality as a whole. We need a few steps in order to get from there to question one, but I think that this is the metaphysical vision behind that. Question two needs no such assumptions, I say, and it doesn't need an answer to the mental physical question. And I think therefore it's actually more empirically tractable, and so a more acceptable question for a naturalistic philosopher. So I commend this question to you. Thank you very much.